Before history was written, before time was counted, before humanity learned to name itself, there were civilizations that lived, thrived, and disappeared, leaving behind a world that no longer remembers them, not because they were insignificant, but because they existed too early and knew too much. History, as we are taught, begins neatly. Civilization rises from primitive chaos, agriculture sparks settlement, writing emerges, and progress unfolds in a linear march toward modernity. This narrative is comforting. It suggests order, control, predictability. But the Earth does not agree with this story. Beneath our cities lie older cities. Beneath those, older ruins still, stone upon stone, civilization layered like sediment, compressed by time, catastrophe, and forgetting. The deeper we dig, the more uncomfortable the questions become. Who built before the first official builders? Who measured the stars before recorded astronomy? Who shaped stone with precision that rivals modern engineering without modern tools? These are not speculative questions anymore. They are archaeological ones. Around the world, evidence continues to surface that civilization did not begin once, but many times, and that each time something ended it, not slowly, not peacefully, but violently enough to reset human memory itself. What we call prehistory may not be primitive at all. It may be the ruins of forgotten sophistication. And if that is true, then history does not move forward. It cycles. Separated by oceans and thousands of years, ancient civilizations share similarities so precise they defy coincidence. Massive stone architecture aligned with celestial events. Sacred geometry repeated across continents. Myths describing floods, fire from the sky, and a lost golden age. Calendars tracking cycles longer than a human lifetime. Maps showing lands that officially did not exist yet. Individually, these details are dismissed as coincidence, symbolism, or primitive misunderstanding. Together, they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. From Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, older than agriculture itself, to submerged stone structures off the coasts of Japan and India. From the precision of Andean masonry to the astronomical mastery of ancient Egypt, humanity's past begins to look less like a beginning and more like a recovery from something lost. Mainstream timelines struggle to explain how early societies could possess such advanced knowledge without the gradual development we expect. But the Earth preserves no record of gradualism here. Instead, it shows interruption, sudden abandonment, abrupt climate shifts, massive flooding, fire, impact. Civilizations do not fade gently in the geological record. They vanish. And when they vanish, so does their memory, unless something survives to carry it forward. This is where myth enters the story, not as fantasy, but as compressed history. Every ancient culture speaks of a time before this one, a golden age, an age of gods, an age of giants, an age when knowledge flowed freely and humanity lived in balance with the earth. Modern thought treats these stories as metaphor, allegory, imagination. But this interpretation assumes ancient people were incapable of preserving truth without writing, an assumption rooted more in arrogance than evidence. Before writing, memory was sacred. Knowledge was encoded in story, symbol, ritual, and sky, passed orally with precision, protected through repetition, designed to survive catastrophe, not libraries. Flood myths appear on every inhabited continent, not as vague metaphors, but as detailed narratives describing rising waters, falling fire, and the near-total destruction of humanity. The names change, the sequence does not. These stories do not describe fear, they describe remembrance. What if myths are not fantasies, but warnings? What if they exist because someone survived long enough to remember what happened before? If so, then ancient civilizations were not ignorant of catastrophe. They were shaped by it. And the monuments they left behind were not merely expressions of belief, but safeguards against forgetting. Stone remembers what humans do not. The Earth carries scars older than civilization itself. Not myths, not legends, but physical wounds etched into rock, ice, and ocean floor. Across the planet, geology tells a story of sudden violence, of rapid climate shifts, massive flooding, and abrupt extinction events that do not align with the slow, gradual change described in textbooks. Entire ecosystems vanished within decades, sometimes years. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet, coastlines drowned, habitable worlds disappeared beneath water and sediment. And where there were ecosystems, there were people. Civilizations tend to form where water, climate stability, and fertile land converge. Yet many of the most promising ancient regions, now submerged, show signs of human modification. Structures beneath oceans, stone formations aligned unnaturally, terraces where no terraces should exist. If these areas were once above water, then the civilizations that occupied them would not be counted in history. They would be erased by geography itself. What we call the end of the Ice Age was not a gentle warming. It was a planetary convulsion. Ice sheets collapsed, meltwater surged across continents, rivers became oceans, shorelines vanished. Civilization did not slowly migrate inland, it ran, and many did not escape. Collapse is not random. When civilizations disappear across multiple regions at roughly the same time, the cause is rarely local. It is systemic, planetary, something capable of overwhelming all defenses simultaneously. Ancient records, where they exist, describe a world thrown out of balance, the sun behaving strangely, the sky burning, the earth shaking, seasons failing, crops dying, seas rising. Modern science offers parallels: asteroid impacts, solar events, geomagnetic excursions, rapid glacial melt, and atmospheric disruption. None require imagination. All are real. All are capable of ending civilization in a matter of years. What is disturbing is not that such events occurred. It is that ancient cultures seemed to expect them. They tracked cycles far longer than a human lifetime. They encoded timelines into monuments that only make sense when viewed over thousands of years. They spoke of recurring destruction, not as prophecy, but as memory. Civilization to them was temporary by default, and that understanding shaped everything they built. When catastrophe strikes at a planetary scale, survival becomes immediate. There is no time to preserve libraries, no capacity to maintain institutions, no luxury of continuity. What survives is not knowledge, it is instinct. Small groups scatter, languages fracture, skills simplify, complex systems collapse into basic survival behaviors. Within a few generations, advanced understanding becomes indistinguishable from myth. Tools break, techniques are lost, precision fades. This is not speculation. It is observable in every known collapse, ancient and modern. The difference with prehistoric catastrophes is scale. If a global disaster reduced humanity to isolated pockets of survivors, then the loss of knowledge would not be gradual, it would be absolute. Entire worldviews erased in a single generation, children raised without context, stories stripped of detail, meaning reduced to symbol. This is how gods are born, not from imagination, but from memory without explanation. Advanced ancestors become divine figures, technologies become magic, scientific understanding becomes ritual. What once was practical knowledge transforms into sacred story. And over time, even the story erodes. What remains is reverence without comprehension. This is the great forgetting. It explains why humanity appears to start over, why agriculture emerges suddenly, why monumental architecture appears without clear developmental steps, why ancient cultures seem obsessed with preserving knowledge in stone rather than paper. They were not building for their present. They were building for a future they feared would forget them. And they were right. After catastrophe, humanity did not begin again from nothing. It began from fragments. Small groups of survivors returned to a scarred world, changed coastlines, altered climates, unfamiliar skies. They found ruins whose purpose they no longer understood. Stones shaped with impossible precision. Structures aligned to celestial events they could no longer calculate.
These survivors did what humans have always done. They adapted. They reused what they found. They built new shelters among ancient foundations. They copied forms without fully grasping function. Over time, these adaptations became tradition. Tradition became culture. Culture became civilization. This is how new civilizations emerge, not as innovators, but as inheritors. Archaeology often describes this process as gradual development, but the evidence suggests something more unsettling: sudden appearances of complex behavior without clear origin, agriculture emerging rapidly, monumental architecture appearing fully formed, symbol systems too advanced for their supposed context. These societies did not invent everything they used. They inherited it, filtered through loss. The result was civilization built atop ruins, unknowingly repeating shapes whose meanings had been severed from their original purpose. A world moving forward while standing on the bones of a forgotten one.
When knowledge survives catastrophe without context, it does not remain knowledge. It becomes ritual. Calendars are maintained long after their astronomical meaning is lost. Ceremonies are repeated without understanding their original function. Symbols persist even when the science behind them disappears. This is why ancient civilizations often appear obsessed with repetition. They were guarding fragments they did not dare alter. Architectural styles remained rigid for centuries. Sacred numbers were preserved with near religious devotion. Measurements were standardized not because they were optimized, but because they were inherited. Innovation slowed not due to lack of intelligence, but due to fear of losing what little remained. In this way, civilization did not simply advance forward, it stabilized, it paused. History's greatest irony is that what we label as primitive societies may actually represent humanity in recovery, carefully holding on to the last surviving pieces of a far older and more advanced world. They were not ignorant, they were cautious. What we call the beginning of civilization may be one of history's greatest misunderstandings. The invention of writing, agriculture, and organized states is often treated as humanity's first awakening. But writing does not signal the birth of intelligence. It signals the fear of forgetting. A society invents writing when memory is no longer enough. If early civilizations truly were the first, why were they already obsessed with recording everything? Why the urgency to catalog laws, gods, stars, kings, and time itself? Why the desperate need to preserve information in clay, stone, and monument? Because they remembered losing it once before. The earliest written texts are not optimistic manifestos of progress. They are anxious inventories, lists of grain, lists of gods, lists of warnings, lists of cycles. They read less like celebrations and more like safeguards. This suggests something profound. History did not begin when humans learned to write. History resumed. Writing was not an innovation born of abundance. It was an emergency response to vulnerability, a realization that oral memory alone could not survive another collapse. This reframes the entire human story. The first civilizations were not pioneers standing at the dawn of progress. They were caretakers standing among ruins, trying desperately to prevent total erasure. They did not write because they had everything figured out. They wrote because they were afraid. Afraid of forgetting again. Across the ancient world, stone speaks a language we still cannot translate. Not metaphorically, but mechanically. Blocks weighing tens, sometimes hundreds of tons, were quarried, transported, lifted, and fitted with a precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate, even with advanced machinery. Surfaces flattened to near-perfect tolerances, angles aligned with mathematical accuracy, joints so tight a blade cannot pass between them. These stones were not stacked, they were engineered. From the megaliths of Baalbek to the Cyclopean walls of Peru, from Egyptian granite chambers to stone platforms buried beneath later civilizations, the pattern repeats relentlessly. The oldest structures are often the most precise. This contradicts the expected trajectory of progress. According to conventional timelines, Early societies should build crudely and improve over time. Instead, archaeology reveals regression. Later cultures reuse, repair, or imitate older stonework, often with visibly inferior results. The implication is uncomfortable. These stones were not the product of trial and error experimentation. They were the remnants of mastery.
Metal corrodes, wood decays, clay dissolves, stone endures. This simple truth may explain one of the greatest mysteries of ancient construction: why civilizations capable of advanced knowledge would invest immense effort into stone architecture instead of more flexible materials. The answer is not aesthetic. It is temporal. Stone is a message sent across time. A civilization that expects continuity builds for comfort. A civilization that anticipates collapse builds for survival of knowledge. Stone does not require maintenance. It resists fire, flood, and neglect. It survives long enough to be rediscovered by cultures who may not understand it, but cannot ignore it. This suggests long-term thinking far beyond what we attribute to ancient societies. They were not building monuments to celebrate power. They were building anchors, markers designed to survive when everything else failed. Stone was chosen not because it was easy, but because it was inevitable.
At a certain point, the evidence forces an uncomfortable question, not how ancient civilizations moved stone, but what they understood about matter itself. Traditional explanations rely on brute force, ramps, ropes, slaves, time, but these explanations collapse under scrutiny when faced with the scale, precision, and consistency observed across continents. Ramps leave traces. Tool marks tell stories. Labor leaves logistical footprints. Yet many of the most advanced stoneworks leave behind none of these. Instead, they suggest methods that minimized force, maximized control, and prioritized precision over speed. Techniques that imply knowledge of resonance, vibration, harmonics, or properties of stone we barely study today. This is where archaeology grows quiet, not because answers are impossible, but because they are disruptive. To accept that ancient civilizations possessed technological understanding beyond what we attribute to them would require rewriting the foundation of human progress. It would mean acknowledging that knowledge can be lost, not just delayed. It would mean admitting that history is not a ladder. It is a spiral. Across the ancient world, myths speak of sound shaping stone, of chants, tones, and frequencies capable of altering matter. These stories are dismissed as metaphor, but modern physics has proven that vibration can influence structure at the molecular level. What ancient cultures mythologized, modern science has only begun to quantify. This raises a chilling possibility: that the builders of the oldest monuments were not primitive engineers, but sophisticated observers of natural law. That their technology was not mechanical, but environmental, integrated, elegant, silent. And most disturbing of all, that it worked. The absence of evidence may not indicate ignorance. It may indicate mastery so refined it left nothing behind but results. We are not uncomfortable because these ideas are impossible. We are uncomfortable because they challenge our sense of superiority.
Across the ancient world, stone does something unexpected. It looks upward. Monuments built thousands of years apart, by cultures with no known contact, align with the same celestial events: solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, stellar risings. Temples become calendars. Pyramids become mirrors of the sky. Stone circles track movements that take decades to repeat. These structures were not placed randomly. They were positioned with intention so precise it demands explanation. To align architecture with celestial cycles requires generations of observation. It requires patience beyond a single lifetime. It requires a worldview that sees humanity not as separate from the cosmos, but embedded within it. These builders were not merely worshiping the sky, they were studying it. The sky was their clock, their archive, their warning system. It told them when floods would come, when seasons would fail, when cycles would repeat. The heavens were not abstract, they were practical. Stone was used because it could remember what humans could not.
Most societies measure time in years. Ancient civilizations measured it in ages. They tracked cycles that stretched beyond dynasties, beyond empires, beyond memory itself. Precession of the equinoxes, grand solar cycles, long lunar rhythms that repeat only once every 18 or 19 years. Some calendars extend tens of thousands of years into the past and future. This is not the behavior of short-lived cultures. This is the thinking of a civilization concerned with recurrence. Agricultural societies need seasons. Empires need years. But civilizations that track planetary cycles are preparing for something larger, events that unfold slowly, invisibly, and inevitably. Why would ancient peoples invest such effort into tracking timescales they would never personally experience? Because someone before them already had. Time for these civilizations was not a straight line. It was a loop, a pattern, a warning encoded in the sky. And the sky, unlike libraries, cannot burn.
At the deepest level, ancient astronomy reveals something profoundly unsettling. These civilizations were not merely observing the sky to tell time. They were using time to remember catastrophe. Long cycles matter only if something repeats. Precession matters only if you expect the same stars to rise again under the same conditions. Grand cycles matter only if you believe the world itself moves through phases of stability and destruction. This suggests an awareness of cyclical collapse, an understanding that civilizations rise and fall not by chance, but by rhythm. Modern society views catastrophe as anomaly. Ancient civilizations viewed it as certainty. They encoded this certainty into stone and sky so it could survive the forgetting that always follows collapse. This is why monuments are placed where the sun touches the horizon at precise moments, why stars were used as markers, why entire landscapes were shaped into observatories. They were building a clock not for daily life, but for civilization itself. A civilization clock. And here lies the most uncomfortable implication of all. If ancient civilizations tracked cycles longer than recorded history, then they may have inherited this knowledge from even earlier ones, which means the awareness of collapse predates agriculture, writing, and empire, meaning humanity has known this truth for far longer than we remember. The sky does not lie. It repeats. And every civilization that fails to listen eventually disappears into the silence between cycles. We do not fear the end because it is unknown. We fear it because, somewhere deep within us, it feels familiar.
There is no ancient culture without a flood. Not one. From Mesopotamia to the Andes, from India to the Pacific Islands, from Africa to Northern Europe, humanity tells the same story with unsettling consistency. A world overwhelmed by water, a civilization erased, a few survivors carrying memory into a new age. Different names, different gods, the same sequence. The waters rise suddenly, the sky darkens, the land disappears, civilization ends. Those who survive do not rebuild immediately. They mourn, remember, and warn. This convergence cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Cultures separated by oceans, millennia, and language do not independently invent the same trauma in the same order. Memory travels, trauma persists, and the flood appears not as metaphor, but as event. Modern geology confirms that massive meltwater pulses occurred at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose faster than ecosystems could adapt. Entire coastlines vanished within human memory. Civilizations built near water, where life flourishes, were the first to disappear. What myth preserves, geology confirms. The flood was not local, it was global. Flood myths often focus on survival, but rarely on victory. The survivors are not conquerors, they are witnesses. They do not celebrate being chosen, they grieve what was lost. Their stories are heavy with guilt, fear, and obligation. They were not saved to rule, but to remember. This detail matters. If these myths were invented to glorify power, they would depict triumph. Instead, they depict trauma.
The survivors are burdened with knowledge no one else wants to hear. They become elders, prophets, carriers of warning. This is the psychology of real catastrophe. Civilizations that endure disaster do not romanticize it. They encode it as taboo. They pass it down carefully, often with fear. Children are taught not just what happened, but what must never be forgotten. And yet forgetting always comes. Each generation distances itself slightly from the trauma. The story becomes ritual. The ritual becomes tradition. The warning becomes myth. Until it happens again.
There is a reason water terrifies us more than fire. Fire destroys visibly. Water erases silently. A flood does not merely kill, it dissolves. It removes boundaries. It turns familiar landscapes into featureless voids. Roads disappear. Buildings vanish. Memory loses anchors. This is why flood trauma persists across cultures. It represents total loss of orientation. When ancient civilizations encoded flood myths, they were not just remembering destruction, they were preserving the psychological imprint of helplessness. The understanding that no wall, no army, no knowledge could stop the sea once it rose. This fear became civilizational instinct. Cities were rebuilt farther inland, monuments were raised higher, sacred sites were placed on elevated ground. Water was both worshipped and feared, not because it was mystical, but because it had proven unstoppable. Even today, modern humanity reacts to rising seas with denial rather than preparation. We call it gradual, predictable, manageable. Ancient civilizations knew better. They had watched the world disappear. And somewhere deep within us, that memory still whispers. It explains why coastlines feel temporary, why the sound of waves carries unease, why stories of submerged cities captivate us more than any other ruin. Because water does not announce collapse, it arrives quietly, and by the time it is understood, it is already too late.
If water erased the world silently, fire announced its arrival from above. Ancient myths across continents describe a second terror, one that came not from the sea, but from the sky. The sun behaving strangely, the heavens burning, stars falling. A night that turned into endless day, followed by darkness that swallowed the world. These accounts are often dismissed as poetic exaggeration. Yet modern science now recognizes phenomena capable of producing exactly these effects: asteroid impacts, comet fragments, airbursts, and solar events powerful enough to ignite landscapes and disrupt the atmosphere. Evidence of sudden high-temperature events appears in the geological record: layers of melted rock, impact spherules, shocked quartz, and global burn layers dating to periods of massive ecological disruption. Civilizations near coastlines may have survived floods only to be finished by fire. Forests ignited, crops failed, the sky filled with ash, sunlight vanished, temperatures dropped. The end did not come from one direction. It came from everywhere. Ancient texts described a time when the sky could no longer be trusted. The sun dimmed, seasons failed, days passed without warmth. Crops died not from drought, but from cold and darkness. Humanity entered a long winter that did not belong to any season. This is not myth, it is physics. A sufficiently large impact, or series of impacts, would inject dust and aerosols into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight for years. Temperatures would plummet, photosynthesis would collapse, food chains would fail. Civilization does not survive without the sky's cooperation. This explains why ancient cultures revered the heavens and feared them, why gods of the sky were unpredictable, why sacrifices were made not to gain favor, but to restore balance. To ancient humanity, the sky was not abstract, it was alive, and it had turned hostile. The most terrifying possibility is not that catastrophe occurred, it is that it occurred in sequence. Water followed by fire, flood followed by impact, survival followed by annihilation. This is the pattern hinted at in the deepest layers of myth and memory. A civilization nearly destroyed, then finished. A world attempting to recover, then erased completely. This explains the totality of forgetting. A single catastrophe leaves survivors with memory. 2 leave survivors with trauma. 3 leave nothing but fragments. If ancient humanity endured multiple global disasters within a short span of time, the loss of knowledge would not be accidental, it would be inevitable. Language would fracture beyond recovery. Technology would vanish without trace. Cultural continuity would shatter completely. This is not just collapse. This is reset. A planetary eraser event that strips civilization down to instinct and fear. And yet, even this did not erase everything. Something survived. Not machines, not cities, not systems. Warnings. Encoded in myths of fire and flood, in gods who punish from above, in stories that insist humanity once reached too high, knew too much, and paid the price. These are not moral tales. They are survival echoes. And the most disturbing implication of all, if this happened once, it can happen again. After the world collapsed, after water erased cities and fire burned the sky, the survivors faced a problem more dangerous than extinction. How do you preserve truth when truth itself can be lost again? They understood something modern humanity often forgets. Knowledge does not survive simply by existing. It survives only if it is protected from time, fear, and power. If warnings were written plainly, they would be destroyed by those who did not want to hear them. If knowledge were shared freely, it would be corrupted, misused, or forgotten when comfort returned. And if history were told honestly, it would threaten those who benefited from control. So the ancients chose another path. They hid truth inside myth. They wrapped data in ritual. They encoded memory in architecture and sky. This was not deception. It was defense. Knowledge was fragmented intentionally, distributed across symbols, locations, and generations. No single collapse could erase it all. No tyrant could control it fully. No era could destroy it completely. Silence was not absence. It was strategy.
Every ancient civilization had a class whose role was not power, but remembrance. Priests, astronomers, keepers of calendars, builders of monuments, oral historians entrusted with precision beyond storytelling. They were not rulers. They were custodians. Their responsibility was not to govern society, but to ensure that when collapse came again, something would remain. They memorized cycles. They guarded sacred numbers. They aligned structures to stars so future generations, forgotten and confused, could rediscover what had been lost. This role came with sacrifice. Those who carried knowledge often lived apart from society, bound by ritual, restricted by taboo, prevented from innovation not because it was impossible, but because deviation risked distortion. To know the truth of past collapse was to live with constant awareness of fragility. To teach too much too openly was to invite misuse. To teach too little was to risk extinction. So they walked a narrow line. And over time, even the guardians forgot why they guarded. The ritual remained, the meaning faded, and the message waited.
The final stage of any warning is not preservation. It is reception. The ancients did not know who would inherit their message. They did not know what language we would speak, what tools we would use, or what gods we would worship. They only knew one thing. Eventually, another civilization would rise, powerful enough to rediscover the evidence. That civilization is ours. For the first time since the last reset, humanity has the tools to see the full pattern. Satellite imaging reveals submerged cities. Geology confirms rapid catastrophe. Astronomy explains ancient alignments. Physics validates phenomena once dismissed as myth. The fragments are reassembling. And with that reassembly comes responsibility. We can no longer claim ignorance. We can no longer dismiss the past as fantasy.
We can no longer pretend collapse is impossible. The message has reached its destination, and now we face the same choice every civilization eventually faces. Do we listen, or do we repeat? The ruins are not relics, they are mirrors. They show us what happens when knowledge outpaces wisdom, when growth replaces balance, when power silences memory, when civilization forgets that it is temporary. This is the moment the ancients prepared for, not the end of their world, but the test of ours.
Every civilization, at its peak, believes it is unique, not in culture alone, but in destiny. We tell ourselves that we are more advanced, more intelligent, more enlightened than those who came before, that technology has freed us from the limits that bound ancient societies, that science has replaced myth and data has replaced belief. But the ruins tell a different story. The cities buried beneath oceans were once marvels of engineering. The monuments eroded by time required mathematics we only recently rediscovered. The calendars carved into stone tracked celestial cycles with precision rivaling modern observatories. They were not primitive, they were confident. And that confidence became their blind spot. The greatest danger to any civilization is not ignorance, it is certainty. The belief that collapse happens only to others, that warnings from the past are exaggerations, that progress is irreversible. The ancients believed this too, right before everything fell apart. History does not repeat itself exactly. It rhymes. Every lost civilization reached a point where its tools evolved faster than its values, where expansion outpaced restraint, where power centralized while responsibility dissolved. The pattern is unmistakable. Resource exploitation intensifies, environmental systems destabilize, social inequality grows. Knowledge becomes specialized, fragmented, inaccessible to the many, and controlled by the few. And then, stress. Not a single event, but a cascade. Climate shifts, infrastructure failures, political fractures. Systems designed for stability collapse under pressure they were never meant to endure. The ancients recorded this moment, not as prophecy, but as experience. They did not fall because they lacked intelligence. They fell because intelligence alone was not enough. Look around. Rising seas reclaim coastlines. Weather systems grow violent and unpredictable. Ecosystems collapse faster than they can recover. Information floods every mind, yet understanding grows thinner. We call this coincidence. The ancients would have called it a phase. A civilization approaching its threshold does not collapse suddenly. It destabilizes quietly. Warnings appear everywhere, but they are ignored because they are inconvenient. Solutions exist, but they require sacrifice, and sacrifice is always postponed until it is forced. The ruins beneath our feet are not ancient history, they are future archaeology. The ancients did not leave us blueprints for salvation. They left us something far more valuable: perspective. They showed us that civilization is fragile, that greatness does not guarantee permanence, that forgetting the past is the fastest way to repeat it. Their final message was not carved in stone words, but in stone consequences. We are not meant to worship them. We are not meant to imitate them. We are meant to learn, because the cycle only continues when the lesson is ignored. Every civilization reaches a moment when continuation is no longer automatic, a moment when survival requires conscious change. The lost civilizations failed not because they were doomed, but because they chose comfort over correction. They waited for certainty. They delayed action. They trusted that someone else would fix the problem. By the time they acted, the window had closed. We are standing at that same threshold, and unlike them, we know how the story ends. This documentary is not about the past. It is about memory. The lost civilizations are not warnings of inevitability. They are invitations to awareness. They ask us to slow down, to remember balance, to value wisdom as much as knowledge. If their voices could speak, they would not say, "We were destroyed," they would say, "We were once where you are now." What happens next has not been written in stone yet.